Hey guys, it's an American Thinks, back for another short story review for Thousand Worlds Book Club, George R. R. Martin's Tuf Voyaging series, and this one is Loaves and Fishes. And Preston, what a rabbit's hole you have led us down with this Tuf Voyaging series, because man, there's a lot of stuff to cover here. But anyways, let's get to it, and I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. We've previously mentioned in this discussion before, George R. R. Martin likes to write a lot from the perspective of the Vietnam War. I think we've touched on that several times in these stories. And typically with the Vietnam generation, peak oil is also a big deal. This results from the oil crisis in the 1970s. And perhaps not coincidentally, this is about the same time that George R. R. Martin began writing the Tuf Voyaging series. And, also perhaps not coincidentally, he finished right around the outset of the S&L crisis in the mid-'80s. So, to me, this story, it speaks really strongly of these events. And George R. R. Martin really has a lot of traits of people who became politically aware during the 60s and 70s. So you could start out with, on the one bookend, you have the Vietnam War, where, this whole generation of young people felt disenfranchised by the government, and they felt compelled to follow something they didn't believe in, and they learned not to trust the government. That was made worse by Richard Nixon. In the Watergate scandal, everyone found out he was a liar, and then the oil crisis happened. And then there was the escalation of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then ultimately the other bookend I'll stop at here is the S&L crisis in the mid-'80s. And while all this was going on, George R. R. Martin was writing this Tuf Voyaging series. Really those are pretty much the two bookends. Those are the things that were going on in the country while he was writing these stories. And so because of all this, a lot of people in his generation got to be very cynical and quite wary about large institutions, and particularly the government. Started to see the government taking on a life and direction and morals of its own, and not really being by the people, for the people. And I think this is probably particularly frustrating because many people in this generation started going to college and getting degrees, whereas their parents, many did not have college degrees and that level of education. So it was a lot easier for this generation to think of themselves as intellectuals, or what I would call kind of more tongue-in-cheek pseudo-intellectuals, and they see themselves as big thinkers, and they see the big picture, and they know better, and everyone else is just following the government and their sheep. Not necessarily always the government. This could be applied to other institutions like schools, churches, businesses, what have you. Think of a big institution. And it's, in this generation, I think it's a lot harder for people to, get on with the establishment and be on board with everything. And I think that this gets exhibited very strongly in the characters of both Tuf and Tolly Moon, where they're both free thinkers, and they feel, or at least they act, like they're ostracized from the establishment, and they know better, and if people would just listen to their ideas and implement them, they could fix the challenges actually being faced by the establishment, but instead they're shunned and left on their own. And in the end, even when they are right, no one really appreciates their victories. They're really the only people celebrating their own victories. So there's sort of this, isolated intellectual elite, which I think, does have some appeal. I think they make good literary heroes, or, maybe you could call them anti-heroes, I guess. They're not necessarily heroes in the traditional sense, but, they're good heroes for the baby boomer hippie generation. I think they could relate a lot to this. Anyways. One more quick point here. I'll try to get through this one as quickly as I can. I was really debating whether to touch on this, but I think it is worth talking about it, at least just briefly. George R. R. Martin, he's obviously a really smart guy. When you read any of his books, you realize that this is a guy that has spent a lot of time accumulating a lot of knowledge, and it's very evident. On the other hand, no writer is perfect, and I've said before, George R. R. Martin is a 100% match for me. I think he comes very close, but there's still some things that just don't jive with me, I guess. And I had a big suspense of disbelief moment in this story. The whole impetus behind the setting is that this world, Suthlam, is approaching their peak oil crisis, and they're not doing anything about it. And so this problem is looming on the horizon. And if you follow this train of thought, George R. R. Martin knows enough about economics to conclude that, if religion is making the population go up, then as the population goes up, demand for food goes up. And if demand for food exceeds your planet's natural food production, you have to start importing, and if that doesn't work, then you have to start manufacturing it artificially, which they're doing. And if they're manufacturing it artificially, then demand for fuel goes up, and hence they're draining their planet's fuel supplies, right? So this is essentially their oil crisis. But he doesn't really follow this through to its natural conclusion. You take this a few more steps. This is kind of economics 101. If demand for fuel goes up and supply is decreasing, then the price of fuel would increase dramatically. And if the price of fuel increases, then the price of what you're manufacturing, in this case food, would increase as well. And if the price of food increases, people can't afford to feed themselves, much less their kids. Hence they have fewer kids. The government doesn't really need to regulate anything. This happens in high population density countries like Japan or some European countries where the birth rate is naturally declining on its own. The governments aren't legislating anything. In fact, in some of these countries, it's the opposite. They're trying to encourage people to have more kids, but it's not working. It's their cost of living is simply too high. Then he presents this argument of course, well, their religion says that they should. And to which I respond, well, so what about that? People ignore their religion all the time due to economic circumstances. On a micro scale, you have this classic example of a beggar stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family. And most people, hear this sad story, and the natural reaction is, oh, this poor guy. We should make sure that he has food so he doesn't steal anymore. Which, is kind of, if you take a hardline approach to it, he actually stole something. He committed a crime, and yet we're feeling bad for him because of his economic circumstances. Or if you took this on a macro scale, the United States during this most recent recession, charitable donations dropped around 7% in what was ultimately a fairly moderate economic recession. For people that went through it, it was a pretty big deal. But in the grand scheme of things, compared to the Great Depression or other economic events that have happened, the recession was pretty moderate, and our charitable donations dropped notably to the tune of billions of dollars. By the way, if you're an American, give yourself a pat on the back because to have a nation that's literally donating billions and billions of tens of billions of dollars, and to have that that ability and that willingness to do that, it's a pretty cool thing. So I think this is pretty consistent throughout history. If you want more examples, Jared Diamond, he's a guy that was famous for Guns, Germs, and Steel. He wrote another book following up on that one called Collapse, where he examines why civilizations collapse. And you can find plenty of examples there, or in other places you might want to poke throughout history, but it's pretty consistent. Economics is kind of the big driver, and if your economy doesn't allow you to do something, then you don't do it. I mean, it's just simply not there. The utility isn't there. So anyways, just, my one, primary beef with this story, I kept reading it and I did enjoy it. It's still a well-written story, and I think it raises a lot of interesting questions. It was just kind of my challenge in getting through the story was, that economic framework that he's presenting. Anyways, so let's dig into this a little bit. Preston has been pretty consistently examining the character of Tuf and what makes him a hero or makes him God, which is a pretty interesting word to use. In my review, if you guys go back to the beginning of this, the very first one we did, the hero. And in my review of the hero, I brought up the concept of the Fermi paradox and the nature of intelligent life to destroy itself. This has been something that's been theorized for quite a while. It's examined, quite a bit in fiction. This isn't the only one. It's examined a bit in fiction, and a lot of theoretical thinkers have a lot of ideas on this. But in this case, this is one example of it. It's the Suthlam. They're destroying themselves in this case because of their religion. It's not always religion in these stories. There's other reasons for it, but in this case, it's their religion. Tuf steps in. He's essentially playing the God role by saving these people from their flaws. And in fact, you could say that Tali Moon is practically praying to him, trying to get him to use his power for what she considers good. And then at the end, she becomes his follower. So, it's this is an allegory a little bit. But in the end, ultimately, not bad for a writer who supposedly doesn't like religion that much. It does have a lot of religious overtones. And I think that there's more to it than that. That's sort of just broad strokes examination of the character of Tuf. But I think there's more to it. Ultimately, let's look at this from the species standpoint again. Every species is struggling for survival. At some point, your species, according to this Fermi paradox theory, your species ends up struggling for survival against itself, against its own inherent nature. And if Tuf is one character in this broad scheme of species survival, how does he survive? Well, let's talk about the strongest of the species for a bit. Tuf is tall. It's mentioned very frequently. He's tall. He is physically imposing, or at least he could be if he wanted to. He doesn't really use his size to assert himself over other people that much. You could think of other characters like Gregor Clegane or Duncan the Tall that were large people, and they used it to their martial advantage. But Tuf is not really one of those characters, even though apparently he could be if he wanted to. He just doesn't. And then, let's see, there's the intelligent of the species. I think we could all probably agree that Tuf is a very intelligent guy. And we do actually see him much more using his intelligence to solve problems. So I think we do have that. But also very often, he really doesn't use his intelligence to solve problems. Very often, in fact, I'd maybe say more frequently, he just simply, digs his heels in and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. He gets stubborn about it, or, maybe you don't call it stubborn, you could just call it persistent, or, whatever term you want to use. He just says, no, I'm not going to do that. No, not going to happen. And this happens over and over again. And I would also take this a step further and say, maybe he's intelligent, but he's not necessarily the most intelligent person in this imagined world. I think there's probably lots of other people that are. He can't repair his own ship. In fact, if you want to talk about the ship, I'd say the EEC who built the ship in the first place were certainly more intelligent than Tuf is now, but yet they're all dead. So maybe he's intelligent, but he's not the most intelligent. But I think that he does have a very demonstrated ability to adapt to change. And, like, hey, they took my cat, now how am I going to get my cat back? And he doesn't approach this from an emotional standpoint. This was my big takeaway from the last review. If you want to go look at that, I get into a little bit of neuroscience behind this. He doesn't respond to these things emotionally. He'll process them rationally, and he'll come up with a course of action and then execute. But so far in just these two stories that we've seen, he's been presented with a very wide array of very diverse challenges. And so far, he's been able to think his way through each one of them and adapt himself accordingly. And I think it speaks very strongly about his ability to navigate in this very broad scheme, lofty environment of species survival. And now, this is the first story where he has this ship, and he's using this ship to effect change proactively. And I'm saying that whereas, evolution, the natural process of evolution, it's reactive. It's a reactive process of adaptation to other stimuli in the environment. Tuf can manipulate genetics on a proactive basis to face challenges that are coming up in the future. You can respond to them before that they happen. And he has so far used this power for, I think, what we would call good, to keep humanity from destroying itself. And so he is sort of this marriage. Tuf is this marriage between you have intelligence, you have the power to create, or conversely, you have the power to destroy, and he has the willingness to do good. In this sense, Tuf is essentially God. And in this context, I don't think it's coincidence that the two dreadnoughts, if you remember at the end of the story when they're digging out of the system and there's two dreadnoughts that are being sent to chase them down, it's not coincidence that these two dreadnoughts are named the Double Helix and the Charles Darwin. Okay? And this is essentially, I think, Tuf in a nutshell. So, final point. We're reading this in the context of A Song of Ice and Fire and trying to understand that series better, and so we're digging into George R. R. Martin's other work. And, I go through and look for analogs, and, again, this is another one where I think Preston covered a lot of the topics pretty thoroughly. Last time, I mentioned, last time being the previous review of the Plague Star. And I mentioned that there are two characters who seem to be pretty good analogs for Tuf, that being Serial Pharrell and Varys, who, by the way, as long as we, Preston mentioned this in his review, we're talking about flies and spiders. Varys is called the spider. But anyway, so those are the two I found after that story, after that first story. Now, after seeing this one and putting a little bit more thought into it, I think there is one more character who I see that fits the analog of Tuf pretty well. Someone who, let's count this off. So there's somebody who loves food, is fat, is intelligent, demonstrates emotional control and rational thinking, is not afraid to meet face-to-face with his enemies and study them personally, and he even eats and drinks with them. And he has something that he loves that's been taken away from him, and he's working to get it back. So, that character is, ladies and gentlemen, behind this door, Bachelor number 3, drumroll, I give you Wyman Manderly. So, think that over. If you have any thoughts, agreements, disagreements, ideas, whatever you want related to this topic, leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the next story.